One of the things that I remember when I was growing up is that my mum was really into watching the programme Call My Bluff. I don't know how many of you remember that, but it was a programme where somebody would come up with these words that nobody ever heard of, and three people would give definitions for that word, and then they would, the other team would try and guess what the answer was. And the presenter, after they'd gone through the thing, would say, "Will the person with the real answer say so?" We were looking at this story with adventurers this morning, and we got out a bit of pizza from the creche cupboard and said to them, "Do you fancy this for lunch?" You can guess what the answer was. They didn't. They wanted the real thing. And isn't that true for all of us? We want the real thing. We don't want something that's fake. We don't want something that's second-rate. We want something that is real. And that's a bit like what was happening in this story that Paul just read. Just to give you a bit of context, Ahab was the king of Israel. And if you turn back to the previous two chapters, to chapter 16, we read these damning words about Ahab. In verse 30, it says, "Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. He also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him." This was the context in which we have this story. Ahab was a dreadful king. And God had sent his prophet, Elisha, to speak to him. And in the beginning of chapter 17, we read that Elijah went to Ahab and told him, because of what he has done, that God was going to bring a drought on the land, that there would be no more rain. And then as we move to chapter 18, if you read the beginning part of it, you will see a picture of Ahab going out searching for water. This was probably about 3 years later, 2 to 3 years later. There had been a drought for that long, and Ahab was desperately looking for water to feed his animals. And in verse 1 of chapter 18, we read that the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." God is going to have mercy on Israel. They hadn't turned away from what had happened, but God was going to send the rain. And then we come to the encounter that we are thinking about, that is recorded from verse 16 onwards. That Ahab eventually comes and meets with Elijah. And we have that account in the rest of the chapter. And there's three things that I really just want to leave with you this evening about what we see in this passage. And the first thing we see is a choice. Which God will you follow? You see, we have three people in this, or three groups of people. We have Elijah. We know that Elijah is a man of God. He's following God wholeheartedly. He's prepared to put his life on the line to speak God's word. We've just seen what Ahab is like, who's gone to the other extreme, who's worshipped any other god apart from the God of Israel, and has built up altars and sacrifices, made sacrifices at these altars to these idols of Baal and Asherah and who knows who else. And at the beginning, when Elijah and Ahab meet, Ahab calls Elijah the troubler of Israel, because he's the one that made spoke for God and said that there would be a drought. Elijah turns that back on his head in the following verse and says, no, you are the troubler of Israel. Why? Because you've abandoned or forsaken the commands of God. And you followed after other gods. You see, Ahab blamed other people. He was quick to blame somebody else for the mess that his country was in, when in reality, he was the cause. And then we have the third group of people, which is the whole other people of Israel. And what do we know about them? Well, basically, verse 21 tells us that they're sitting on the fence. They're wavering, they're faltering, they're limping between, depending on which translation you use, two opinions. They want to follow Baal, they want to follow God. They want to follow the God that suits their purpose at the time. They're keeping their options open. They're doing what they think is best that will help them in the future, keeping all their options open. I wonder if you were to identify yourself with one of those groups of people, which one you would do that this evening? Which group would you identify yourself with? Because Elijah gives these people a choice. He says, you can't follow both. In verse 21, he says, if the Lord is God, follow him. But if it's Baal, follow him. And we have that same choice today. Who are we going to follow? We can't really sit on the fence. We know it's a dangerous place to sit. But we don't have gods like Baal really so much, not in Western society. We don't have statues really that we go around and worship and make sacrifices at. But there are lots and lots of other gods. There are lots of other things that become the most important thing in our lives. And often they're aligned to money. Maybe it's we want to get the highest salary that we can get. We want to own the best possessions that we have. We want to change our car so regularly that we've always got the latest one. We want to progress in our career. We want to go as far as we can. But maybe it's things like putting our family before God. Maybe it's making sure that we have a good social life. Maybe it's we enjoy our holidays. Whatever it might be, these things so easily come in and become the most important thing. And isn't our society one that likes to keep all our options open? We want to do the best we can, but we want to make sure that we don't miss out. So we'll follow this and we'll follow that and we'll follow the other, and we'll do what's best for us at the time. It sounds like a good option, doesn't it? It sounds like it's the best way to go. But it's interesting to read in verse 21 how Elijah describes it. How long will you waver or you'll falter between two opinions? The word there can be translated waver or falter. In other translations, it's limp. And it's kind of showing us that we can attempt to follow the best way that we want to. We can attempt to keep all of our options open. We can attempt to follow this God and that God or that thing and that or whatever. But if we do, we kind of injure ourselves. In reality, it cripples us. It makes us limp. Because we can't do that, can we? We can't really sit on the fence. It's painful if you've ever sat on one for too long. We don't do it, do we? It's not a place that we can have. We can't be all things to all people. We are given the same choice as the people of Israel then. Do we follow God or do we follow other gods? Jesus himself told us in Luke, or it's recorded in Matthew 2, that we can't serve two masters. Either you will serve one or you'll serve the other. You can't do or follow two. God, you see, knows our hearts. And I wonder what he sees in your heart this evening. Who are you following? But then we see, secondly, the challenge. Who is the true God? In verses 22 onwards, Elijah gathers or gets Ahab to gather all the people together. They all come to Mount Carmel. They're not sure exactly where it is because Carmel is more of a range of mountains, not far from the sea. But he gathers all the people of Israel. They are there up on the halfway up the mountain, probably. And he suggests a challenge. The only way that we can know which God is who is the real God is that we'll have this challenge. We'll both build altars, we'll both put a sacrifice on it, and we'll call on our God and see which God answers with fire. In verse 24, we read that the people thought that was a great idea. That is something that we can do. Baal was known in those days as a god of the weather. He controlled the weather. He controlled the rain. He controlled the lightning. Therefore, it would seem a fair challenge which God would answer with fire. It would clearly demonstrate who is the real God. And then if you read through the verses, you see the two compared and contrasted. You see both of them built an altar. In verse 25, the prophets of Baal went first and they prepared their altar. And it's a very brief description of what they did. But they didn't put any fire underneath it. But if you go through what Elijah did a bit later on, he went to great lengths in terms of building his altar. We read particularly that he used stones as well to represent the tribes of Israel, and he put wood on top. Then he laid the meat on top of that, and then he went even further and decided that he would pour water over it. Who knows where he got the water from, given that it was a drought, but we're not told. But they got water from somewhere, and they poured loads of water on the altar. One of the altars was dry, one of them was wet. And then we see that both of them prayed. Verses 26 to 28 describe the prophets of Baal as they prayed to their God. There was 450 of them, and there was also 400 prophets of Asherah. So that's a huge number of people all praying around this altar, asking that their God would send fire. And they prayed for hours and hours and hours and hours. It went on and on and on. 850 men praying for the best part of a day. But Elijah also prayed, but he was a man on his own. There was just one. In verses 36 to 37, we read of his prayer. And just look how he prays. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He's referring back to the covenant God of Israel. Let it be known today that you are God in Israel. You see, God's honour was at stake here. What would happen if Baal had won? Then everybody would have followed Baal. Israel, effectively, as a covenant of people of God, could have been wiped out. God's honour was at stake. And so Elijah prays that God will hear him so that his honour will be restored. Answer me, Lord, answer me, verse 37 says, so that the people will know that you are the Lord God. It all seems a bit one-sided, doesn't it? We've got a dry altar with 850 men around it against another altar which is wet or soaked with one man praying. But we only see one answer. Verse 29 tells us what happened to the prophets of Baal. It's actually mentioned twice that there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. Despite all that they did, despite all of the noise that they made, despite all of the things that they prayed, they slashed themselves and did all sorts of other things, there was no answer. Despite praying for the best part of a day, they'd given themselves completely to it, they'd been committed to it, there was no answer. But what happens when Elijah prays? Verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell. You see, God answered Elijah's prayer pretty much immediately. Now today we're not going to go through the whole kind of ritual of building up altars and praying to our God and seeing whether fire will come. That's not how we find out about God, is it, these days? How do we find out about God? How do people know who God is? How can they know about the covenant God of Israel? Maybe you're in that position this evening and you want to find out more. How do you do it? God speaks through the Bible. God speaks through his word. That's how we find out about God. And if you want to know who the real God is, maybe you are wavering between these two opinions, you don't really know who the real God is, then let me encourage you to read the Bible. Because that will tell you everything you need to know about God. You can read the books of the other religions. You can read the books of the current philosophy of our society here today. And you can read the Bible. And if you do both, or do the more, you will come to see, if you come with it with an open mind, who the real God is. But you also get to see it through people who follow him. People had seen Elijah. They'd seen him stand up against Ahab. And you can see God at work in other Christians' lives. If you want to know what a difference God makes, talk to somebody you know who is a Christian, who's following him. And they can tell you, and you can see by the way that they live their lives and the way that they act and the way that they behave, that they are following God. Speak to them. Talk to them. Ask them any questions that you wish, so that you can find out who is the true God. But then finally we have the consequences. The Lord, he is God. The people immediately know who the God is, because God sends fire. Not only is the meat consumed and the wood burnt, the stones burnt to ashes, there is absolutely nothing left. The people know that God is the one true God. And they fall prostrate, verse 39 tells us, and cry, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." God has revealed himself to them. They now know who is the true God. The altar for Baal is still there. He's nowhere to be seen. The altar for God is destroyed by fire that's sent from God. And they know that he is the true God. Elijah says in verse 37, when he's praying for God to answer him, he says, "Answer me so that they will know, Lord, that you are God, but also that they will know that you are turning their hearts back to him again." You see, God is showing mercy to them. And they respond to that as they get rid of all of the things that are related to Baal. It's pretty gruesome, but that's what happens. They get rid of all the prophets. They turn to follow the one true God. And then the following consequence is that God responds to them and sends rain. You have that in the verses at the end, where Elijah goes up and prays, and eventually we see in verse 45 that heavy rain started to fall. You see, as the people repented from their sin, as they acknowledged that God was the one true God, God sent blessing. God sent rain. The drought was over because they acknowledged that God is the one true God. We've been singing about this evening about what it means to know God as the one true God, as we're singing about honouring Jesus, the name, high over all. Once we acknowledge that, we will want to praise his name forever. As we come to see who is the real God, it will change your life. Because you will see who he is. And you'll see that before him you need to repent of the things that you've done wrong, the things that have angered him. The Bible calls it sin. And we need to seek forgiveness for that so that we can be in a right relationship with God. And once we do that, we will know the blessing of God on our lives. That doesn't mean life will be easy. It doesn't mean life will be all our problems in life will disappear. But it does mean our lives will be blessed because God will touch our lives. It might still be hard, but you will not be disappointed. The people, as they turned to God, were not disappointed because they were then Not only were they in a restored relationship with the covenant God of Israel, but they knew the blessing of God on their daily lives as the rain came. And we too can know a right relationship with God if we acknowledge that he is the one true God. If we then seek to follow him, if we then seek to live for him, we will know that blessing on our lives.